All right. Welcome to Local Energy. My name is Peter Brecht. I'm here with my co-host Wade Speer, and today our guest is Jim Clark. Jim is a Houston-based petroleum engineer leader with 40 plus years of experience. He's currently a CCS Reservoir Analytics Engineer at JWC3 Resources. He has worked Gulf of Mexico with done CO2 enhanced oil recovery, carbon capture storage, data analytics. Before we hit record, he was talking about his time out in California. He's been kind of all over the place, but Jim, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us. How's your morning going?
It's going very well. We're actually working on a project that I was part of my first formal AI class, and I just kept tinkering with it. I should put this. So I actually got lost in the moment this morning, and so I've actually had to put it down. And I'm glad because I still have other things I need to do. So, and this is one of them.
What I want to focus on to start is, you spent decades as a reservoir engineer and now you're in the CCS side as well. But if you had to explain your job to a high schooler or just to me, what problem does a reservoir engineer actually solve?
I would say that I'm trying to think how to say it simply. A reservoir engineer is a subsurface detective. And I say that because so much of the things that I've worked with in my career, more than half of my time has been on projects that actually have been tested and are on production. And what I find really enjoyable about that is it's sort of a whodunit. You have information that's scattered over miles. And one of the things that So I'll give it an out, but basically you've got very little information. You've got a lot of unknowns. And so I've actually used this in a presentation. So this is the only hard data I've got. Okay. So with this data, so I live in a 1-story house. I have to be able to say how many rooms are in the house, how many square feet, how many people live here, and what's your utility bill? What do you pay in taxes? So this is the only hard data I have, which may be a core, a sample of the formation. And with that information, you've got to infer everything else. Now, you can't do it by yourself. You need people with different sets of skills. But I get the most satisfaction out of trying to come up with stories that fit the physics and can be used to make good decisions going forward. So that's not really an oil field answer, but it's kind of the part of how the inside of my brain works.
Yeah. So what are some of the clues that you're looking for as that detective, right? So if you only have a core sample, right, and you were holding a pen a few minutes ago as an example, but if you just had a core sample, like what are some of the things that you can infer from that? Or are you going out to look for, obviously, I'm sure this is happening, but historical records, other things that have been done in the area, other measurements, and really, what are you trying to come up with at that point? What are some of the hard items?
Right. So using going back and using this prop again. So this is some place in a 3-dimensional space where you've got rock. So maybe you have pressure. If you've got pressure at this same place, and hopefully you try to get everything at the same point in 3-dimensional space. And so then you say, well, is there any fluid in there? Is there any oil? Is there gas? Is there water? If you're in the CCS space, do you inject CO2 in this space? And so you're trying to put all this together, and then you're just trying to say, okay, what about over here? What about over here? I can tell you that I know that we can go 3 feet this way, and there's a wall because I can see it, but you can't see it. So how would you infer whether a wall is 3 feet away? Well, if you start thinking of this as a tank, which is basic petroleum engineering experience training, you would see does the pressure increase or decrease when you withdraw something out? If you inject something in at that spot, does the pressure increase or decrease? And so that change in pressure over time is an inference of the size of the volume, sometimes where boundaries are. So it's little clues that you can use to infer, oh, I know a little bit more now based on production. Go to the county and see what sort of records are there in the county of other samples that have been taken, measurements that have been taken. And these are direct measurements. But so many times what you have are indirect measurements. So if someone runs a logging tool down at that same spot, and you may get an idea of what the rock is like, and are there layers? Is a rock favorable for oil and gas production, or water injection, or CO2 injection, or for CO2 storage? So you're trying to say, well, based on this, does it fit this mental model or that we have, that a geoscientist has given us clues on by looking at samples, looking at outcrops, looking at what a geophysicist might have, because they bounce sound waves off of it and look for reflectors in the sound waves for where the speed changes. So you're trying to try to understand the languages of a lot of other people in the subsurface and communicate in a way back and forth that you can share the ideas and say, is my mental model consistent with what your mental model is, if that helps.
Absolutely. And so are you working before the well is drilled, or is this once it's producing and okay, now we're trying to figure out how can we actually increase the recovery out of this well, right? Like where do you fall in the timeline, or maybe it's both?
So early, before you actually hit a discovery of oil and gas, one of the things you'll do is you'll have an idea from someone giving you as what the physical model might be. And there are many times where I'll take and use mathematical models to say, if this is the model that you think might exist, that's my reality, then what if I begin to test that model by looking at the pressure? And what if I want to say, well, if I'm going to withdraw something out of that model, how does the pressure behave? What is the rate change over time? And then with that information, what can I infer? So many times, if you're working in an exploration environment where you don't have any penetrations, where you think might be an accumulation of gas and oil, you'll actually build a model, a mathematical model, and then use it to flow through to see how that behaves. To say, well, here's your model, and if the geologist says that it's 1 millidarcy of permeability, which is a measure of resistance to flow, versus 100 millidarcies, there's an expectation of what the rate capacity is with in that scenario. So it so there's a lot of times that you will do that ahead of time if you have the time and you have the money to infer what the answer is, so that when you actually get down and you get this information, you can compare this reality against your fantasy that you're putting all this together and say, well, can I make a recommendation that's going to be economically viable with this? So you're just trying to put the pieces together, and can you make it fit? And if it fits, then what recommendation would you give to someone that's going to be spending additional money or not?
Yeah. I work closely with a small operator, and I can tell you that when, these guys go out and they raise millions and millions and millions of dollars to drill some of these holes, a lot of times it comes down to talking to someone like you that says, I think, right, within this range that we have a good opportunity, but again, that risk is always there, right? So Wade, real quick, curious, if you would interact with someone like Jim, as a detective here, as you're actually drilling, or if that's sort of like, hey man, it's go time. We got a bit in the ground. Decision's been made. We're gonna just run through this. I mean, is there any conversation there with a reservoir engineer?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, especially pre-well. I mean, the entire team's involved pre-well. I mean, you're getting ready to invest millions of dollars, and so, everyone kind of takes the stage and shares their information and their knowledge, and then you are always trying to come up with a plan to avoid problems, right? Because problems are costly. And then during the well, we're always exchanging information back and forth. Either whether it's through morning meetings or weekly meetings or whatever. Some of it's just confirming stuff that we thought we already knew. Some of it's bringing up new information that maybe changes what Jim was talking about in terms of a mental model. Maybe we've seen some really strange things happen. We're drilling in a super low perm reservoir like a Woodford Shale, and all of a sudden we see a gas kick. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, is that Woodford? I mean, the gamma didn't change, so we're still in the Woodford. Maybe that's a fault or a fracture swarm, or all these different things. And then I also think, post well also, I mean, specifically for reservoir drilling kind of gets to drop the ball a little bit once we finish a well. We look back, we have our lessons learned, and we kind of take that forward. But, as far as a lot of times our involvement, I don't want to say it stops right there, but it definitely decreases at that point. Whereas reservoirs, I think, normally has to come back and evaluate, like, okay, what were my assumptions? What did I predict? And then how was that prediction? And you're kind of constantly reevaluating what you thought was going to happen and what you think will happen if we drill an offset next to it.
Yeah, and Jim, it's got to feel good when you get that answer right? I'm sure you've hit it square before, and it's got to feel good when it's actually producing what you thought it would, right?
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Yeah. Go
So
ahead.
so one question from our academy is, how do oil and gas companies decide which wells to keep producing and which one to abandon? And I think the answer is very simple. It's which ones are economic. But are there certain signals that you as a reservoir engineer would be looking at to say, look, you've got 2 years of life left here, and then you need to start thinking of wrapping it up or doing P&A?
Well, I think that, no one's really going to want to shut a well in unless it's not making enough revenue and producing quantities to keep the well running. But sometimes if you're approaching that, then you get into the world of how is the reservoir performance affecting how the well produces. And then you get to our friends in production engineering who are saying, well, what you're looking at trying to make sure the well produces at its most efficient rate, highest rate, safely every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another skill set that's very important in that process. But the only way that I would say as a reservoir engineer that you recommend that shut the well in is if you take that information and you look at what it costs to operate. So you're working with the production engineer, the operations engineers, and to say, is there anything else we can do to improve the flow capacity of the well, and then combine that back to your mental model of what the reservoir is like and what can be produced from that well. And so can you make a story where you're honoring the physics and also honoring the expenses and the revenue? So some things are very, very up or down sort of decisions, but you almost have to be in the position where you need to be asking these kind of questions, if not every day, every week. I was thinking about you, and one of the things, the worlds I've lived in is supporting the drilling people. And one of the things I'm very sensitive to is if you've got a drilling project underway, you're spending a lot of money. You're spending money at probably the highest, I call it a burn rate. You're burning through cash, and you have many contractors that are trying to work together to accomplish the task. And so you've got to be very sensitive that you're giving the people close to drilling operations what they need to know that they're safe, even though they have their own measurements, but to also give them what they need or anticipate what they're going to need before they have to have it. Because there are times when you get to the bottom of a hole and you get some measurements, the first thing they're going to say is, well, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to continue drilling? Do you want us to abandon the well? And that decision time is really not adding any value. You've got to try to anticipate that so that you can give them your recommendation as soon as you possibly can. So if time allows it, I'll tell you a story about something like this that I did for my clients, my analytics, on a very high rate, high drama sort of project. So, okay, well, a company I worked for in the past, this is kind of these are edge cases because this was some discoveries we were making in the east coast of Africa. I'll just say that. In fact, it was interesting. The project was up in the news today. I was looking at that. I worked on that, and basically, in taking my analytics classes at A&M, my capstone for the project was I had to take a project that was important to the company I was working for and use analytics to the best I had and make recommendations on how to extract values. And so what we basically did was, the short version of the story is we had work that was done that was sitting in data files. There were 1,000 different reservoir simulation runs that were made. We had a development plan, and it was just sitting there in a file. And so my supervisor came to me and said, well, if we get down to the bottom of the hole, and this is $2 million a day kind of operations, deep water, East Africa. And they said, could we determine whether we should keep the well or should we sidetrack it? And I'd never been asked that question before. So I said, well, I don't know. And so we looked at the simulation models, and we could infer what the well log response would be based upon what we would get. And we also knew how the wells would produce. And so I went through, cleaned the data, went through the process of finding trends in the data that you could say, well, would fit certain statistical processes, and then develop 4 or 5 different machine learning models that would predict with confidence, like confidence meaning with 2 or 3% error, what each well would produce over the course of 20 years. Now this is $30 billion project. It's quite high, but the whole idea was, could I come up with a way of predicting whether you should keep the well or not? So I knew that everything would be changing in cost, but the process I came up with and I presented to all the judges was that you could predict with 98% accuracy how much gas a well would produce based upon what the well log response would be. And that was used to say you could come up with basically something that would fit on a spreadsheet, an equation about that long, and you would do a calculation for what the gas recovery of 20 years for that well. Wow. And so I couldn't decide whether you should stay or you should go, but I can give you what the number is. And then given the people that are making the financial decision, they would say, okay, this gives me what I need. So why is that important? Well, it's important because it gives an answer, and that we estimate the turnaround time between TD of the well and getting the calculation done is probably an hour.
Okay.
And so that's pretty fast in drilling and completion operations. And then, but I couldn't tell you what the well would be if you move somewhere else, because I don't know where the wall is. But I can tell you, based upon what I know right here, this is how much gas that well would produce. And I felt like that was, to me, something of value, because I basically came up with numbers at a very efficient on the time basis. And it was all information we had done to prepare to say that the project is good enough that we want to spend $30 billion to do this gas project. So it was a way of taking innocent question, taking data that's sitting in files that we thought were pretty good quality data, that had all the geophysics, the geology, and the production development scenarios, and then ran around and around and around to say what hangs together. And so that was something I did. It's been a couple of years, but thinking about, our drilling representative, Wade, just how can we find ways to give them something that's based on physics and based on the detail work, because it's really cheap to do all this work when it's outside of rig time.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I feel like maybe, I don't know if people patent formulas to figure this stuff out. And now that I think, AI has unlocked everyone to where it's like, hey, let's just put all the data in. The hardest part now is getting all the data. And now we're looking back, like I'm going up to the AEPG has a building up in Orange County, and they're closing it down this Saturday. They have a huge, like, they're just getting rid of all their books. So a lot of people have reached out to me to go, hey, can you go like fill your truck up? And I'm like, you're the 5th person that wants me to fill my truck with books. I need a bigger truck, but what they want is the maps and the data that's in those. And so I was thinking, like, why don't we I have a friend in Oklahoma. Let's just scan them out and send them over there to Scott Casso, and he can, then everyone can have them. But have people patent these equations? Like you're saying, it could fit on a piece of paper. You just put everything in. Are they patenting equations to figure this out, or do they have proprietary ways to, model this?
This was basically creating some algorithms that, with the data, the process, could it be replicated? Sure, it could be. But the idea was not about putting a patent on it, because someone else, there's other algorithms that are coming out there that are being improved over time.
Sure.
So I do want to talk a little bit about AI a little bit, and one of the things that I'm exposed to, and not this podcast because it's too early, but I actually had a conversation with somebody at 8 a.m. last night at the school, and they were saying, well, could we, what can we do to apply AI with with analytics. And I said, well, they're all tied. But I said, but one of the things that I'm very concerned about is the fact that there's an oversimplification of the fact that AI will give me the answer. And I've been working with these systems 30 years now, different levels of detail, but there's no substitute for the domain knowledge. All of these subtle things that are not in, they're not in an LLM. I'm sorry. And one of the things, so this is a commercial for me. One of the things that I'm working on, I'm good friends with the department head of petroleum engineering at Texas A&M. And we've had several conversations about the topic of learning and judgment. And I said, how can we, the challenge is, how can we take a petroleum engineer or any skill, drilling engineer, how can we give them 30 years of experience in 10 years? And you kind of go, well, you gain the experiences. And so what I'm working on today is sort of a prototype I have for how can I take and work on some real data and actually use it as a test bed to onboard, say, this is a very specific project for a reservoir engineer. How can you onboard that reservoir engineer and take them through something that uses AI to counsel you on, this is what I'm seeing in the data. You still have to make the decision. But if you haven't done this process or this calculation, in 10 or 20 years, it's going to take you a while to get this information back up. And so what I've done is take the data that have been stored, it's actual real data, and actually created what I call a reservoir advisor for a very, very small problem. And I've actually sent it out to my friends, said, look, here's 3 fields in the deep water Gulf of Mexico. Said, do you think this helps? But I'm thinking in terms of not just doing AI, but how could you use AI with other things so that it leads people down a path that, helps you gain experience. So for, as an example, I spent a few weeks working on the code as part of my AI program, my last 8-week program. And as I got farther and farther along, I said, well, I've got 3 other fields here, or 2 other fields here. Can I take and apply the same process? And once I had the first one built, I could replicate that within a period of 15 minutes, the same analysis techniques, by just loading the data and then running it. Hit run. And I have a report, I have the plots, and I have the advisory of saying, this is what we think we're seeing. And I'm just thinking that, if you're someone that's trying to learn what's going on, this is much faster than taking and having and open up the book and trying to learn it cold. So I don't know if it's the right thing or not, but my motivation is to try to, how can you find ways to have a more educated workforce more rapidly without having the mistakes of things going bad?
I think what I think through a lot, because I potentially other industries look at this as well, as like, how can we get somebody that has been doing it for a year to act like someone that's been doing it for 3 or 3 for 10, trying to shorten that amount of time with experience. And we see AI or LLMs at a simple level being able to provide that. One observation I've had, though, is that there's an inherent laziness to just trust the outcome, right? So for our academy, if they'll hear this in 2 weeks, but this week I allow them to use AI, but I put certain things in the text that would confuse the AI tool, because I want to know if they're actually reading and verifying what they're putting on paper. And so far, they've been a very astute group. But isn't there a concern maybe that there will be those people that are like, they're lazy and they just trust what's put in front of them? Because I'll be honest, it's a lot easier to just trust it rather than verify it, and so that would be something I'm thinking about. And the other, kind of to dovetail that, is humans seem to have a really good way of finding how to make a mistake, even though people have made it before us, right? So even if you bake all the mistakes that have been made into this algorithm so that it's avoided, we'll find another mistake to make. So I don't know, Jim, Wade, maybe either of you have some ideas on that, but that's sort of my working thesis at the moment.
Well, I think I've gotten better over time, but one of the things I do, if I'm using prompt engineering, for example, and I'm sure that's what you've given them, is you've got a GPT and you're running them through and you're giving them a prompt. there was a discussion. Someone said talking about wanting to, using vibe coding to build a sandwich, and it was too general. And I said, that's right. If you give it a very one-line answer with some of the tools I've got, it's very eager to give you 5 pages of, well, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, trying to anticipate what it is you want, and then maybe become hallucinogenic if you don't, where it's giving you things that very confidently said, I think this is the answer, when you have to know enough about the subject to know whether they're in your pasture or not, or if they're over the fence. It's really easy to accept it.
Is there a particular like AI platform that you like to use? Is Gemini, Anthropic, GPT? I mean, they all do fairly well. They're all very similar, but is there one that you found at this moment that has been the most helpful?
I think ask me next month, and they will be ask me next month. And so this is a race to try to get subscriptions, to get eyeballs, to get get tokens. And so I think it varies. I mean, the one I've used the most is ChatGPT, and then people say, well, no, you shouldn't use ChatGPT. You should use Claude, or Claude, Claude Code, and that's the best. And now they're saying, well, no, now there's the coding version in ChatGPT called Codex. That's better. So it's almost like, what flavor of bourbon do you want to taste? And everyone becomes very passionate about it. So thinking about the fact that you've got interns, there is a tool that's in the academic space. If you're working through a university or academic, it's called, or even on the outside, it's called Boodle Box. And what's good about that is that's really designed for the educational community, but it has a lot of AI tools to help you with your process. It also has a knowledge bank. So let's suppose that, which I think is really cool, let's suppose that I've gone through and really studied, this particular subject, and I've got article. Well, I've got them in files. You can save these into a knowledge bank. So it's almost, many times I will not do anything in ChatGPT or any tool unless I give it some documents that are background information. So here's some background information I want you to have. Now let's start. And Boodlebox has that sort of a knowledge bank where it keeps all of that.
Moving on a little bit here from AI, because I really want to talk about carbon capture. I'm just I'm so interested in this space, and I know there's activity going on. California, I don't think as much, but then again, this is California. We don't have much oil and gas activity or anything underground right now. It's improving slowly, but for a beginner, what's the fundamental difference? And actually, let me back up for a second. Could you briefly, for our audience, explain what carbon capture and CCS is, just at a high level, and then we'll get into some details here.
Okay, well, there's 2 acronyms I think that are worth thinking about. One of them is this CCS, which is carbon capture and sequestration. Also, there's a term called CCUS, which is carbon capture utilization and storage. And the utilization comes through taking CO2 out of the storage site and using it for creating processed products. And not many people in the U.S. I know of are having there are people are using it, but to my knowledge, it's not widely used. So, but people use CCS and CCUS interchangeably when they really are 2 different things. So I wanted to put that up front. Yeah, I know there's a project that used to be Elk Hills Field. I worked at with Chevron for a while. I think they've actually got CO2 in the ground.
Yep.
Right now, they've started the injection. And the whole idea is you need to take CO2 from the atmospheric form of it and put it in supercritical conditions where it weighs like a liquid, but has a viscosity of a gas. It has to be deep enough where the pressure is high enough where it stays in those conditions. Temperature's not too high. And so it's a way of taking it out of the air. And it's there's a very large amount of CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere worldwide through the burning of fossil fuels. And the Department of Energy has got a tremendous number of research projects underway they've had over 20 years. So it's not a technology that's new. They're always looking for ways to look at it more critically and to monitor it. But most of the CCS projects in the U.S. that are underway right now, I mean, there's some that are on the Gulf Coast, but most of the ones that are really mature are ones there's like one in Wyoming, but most of them are where you have CO2 being injected in places like Illinois, Indiana. That's the two ones inside the states I think of. So why is it there? Okay. The reason why it's there right now is one, if they've been doing those projects longer than other ones. So they've actually got the top sides done. Also, the concentration of CO2 coming off of ethanol plants or ammonia plants is relatively high. So you're 85, 95% CO2. So all you really have to do is clean it, take the impurities out, and raise the pressure.
Interesting. Yeah.
It is if you were to go in, for example, my first projects I worked were in the Corpus Christi area, and we had storage sites, and we were working with the DOE, and the most important expense was the cost of converting CO2 to supercritical state. In terms of the total cost of CO2, at $100 a ton, in place 70 or 80% of that cost is putting the CO2 from an atmospheric state to, or the smokestack of a plant to something that can be injected and stored for many hundreds of years. And that's a real problem because the cost is still prohibitive.
Okay. Yeah, the capture part of the carbon capture is the tough part, right?
The capture is where most of the cost is, and we just have not found a way to capture it cost effectively. I mean, the cost of drilling the wells is relatively in a fraction of the total. And the ones that are really expensive are basically the direct air capture, which are great, and they've got places that are doing it, but they haven't got the cost down to anything close to $100 a ton, and sometimes they're $200 or $300 a ton.
So as a reservoir engineer, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but if you're looking at and my thought was originally that they're doing CCS with some of these wells that are no longer producing. Is that always the case, or are we drilling, into new areas to find these? Like, are we looking for actual places like pockets where we can store this?
Well, the good news, bad news. The good news, so in places where we know a lot about the geology, those are places that have lots of wells that are drilled through the geology. So you have a lot of these, in a space. And so, do you have good records? Is it accurate? And in Texas, that's the endemic problem in Texas because it's been so heavily drilled.
Yeah.
And so, yes, theoretically, you could use existing wells and do that, except there's a concern that if these are wells that were drilled 30, 40, 60 years ago, is the mechanical integrity of the cement and the pipe such that we put CO2 down in there that it stays into a formation that it can be stored in. And that's the risk. The risk is that could leak up and come to the surface and broach at the surface, or it could go into a relatively freshwater, brackish water, that you call it UDSW, underground source of drinking water. And so that's the risk that we constantly worry about. So the problem is, a lot about the geology, the layers, where the sands come and go, or where the carbonates can go. And you're trying to find ways to predict that. But if you've got a place and you want to put a plume of 1 mile or 2 miles or 3 miles, and you may have a dozen wells that they had penetrated through that same area, then you got to go through and abandon those wells, or have monitoring wells so if it begins to leak at all, that you've got to shut that well down so it can't leak up. So that is a concern. So where could you go and not have that many wells? Because in places where we have lots of wells, it's a good news, bad news. The geology, you have less uncertainty in the geology, but you have more places that could be potential leak paths. You can go offshore California. You can go offshore Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, and they have relatively few wells. You might have one well per mile, and those are relatively modern wells. Most of those wells have been, drilled in the last 25, 30 years. So they can't, if they've got cement, you can show that they're safe. You can use it, but you've got to transport that CO2 to get to where the well is at those conditions.
Right. Yeah.
And so then you become, well, do you take and have a platform and you inject in there? You could, but that adds to the cost of getting CO2. And if you're having to pay $60, $70 a ton to get it in those conditions, and you pipe it 15 miles away, that pipe can handle the pressure. It has to be clean. It has to be no water, so you have no carbonic acid. So, but there have been studies that have been done to take and bring CO2 in tankers and inject and hook up to a platform and do that. Japan is doing that. Places where they don't have any place to store it, but they have lots of CO2 they're trying to put away.
So my guess here, because I've always thought about, well, like, okay, we got 45Q tax credits, we've got, EOR, so and enhanced oil recovery, and I've always wondered, like, why don't we use and I think you answered my question there. We can't really use it for EOR. We can't use carbon for EOR because it's expensive just to get it in that state. So injecting it would take away probably the entire economic formula of any recovery. I didn't think about that part. That's interesting.
Well, let me give you a challenge question, because it's not something I've been studying this year, but I haven't had conversations with the right people. 25, 30 years ago, I did CO2 flooding in West Texas. CO2 flooding puts CO2 in conditions that are not as high as you would do if you were doing carbon capture. You're just doing enhanced oil recovery. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've been trying to find is water flood units that still exist, that are old. And could you take old water floods and inject CO2 instead of at 3,000 or 4,000 psi, 5,000 psi? Could you inject it at 1,500 psi? That's a gas as opposed to a supercritical liquid. And if you can do that inexpensively, getting it from an industrial source and short pipelines to take it over, you get the 45Q, $85 a ton tax credit, plus you get the opportunity to get additional oil recovery, to get a boost in oil recovery. So you get a double bonus.
Yeah, and not only that, but I'm also thinking the biggest cost. I mean, if you think about the water floods or just water in general, right? Everyone's talking about produced water. Where you probably eliminate a lot of that conversation with that being my one curiosity, and I don't know how this would work, is you're talking about piping carbon offshore. Right now the pipe would have to be watertight, so there's no I guess issue there. But how would that be an issue if you were going to do something like you just described with those water floods?
So what you need to do is we almost need another podcast for this, because that's a whole nother.
No, I know. Sorry.
But that's okay. But I've been trying to study the idea that, okay, we've got data centers, the people that want to put data centers in, and we've got people that need electricity, and so they don't want to use the power from the grid, or they would rather not raise the electricity rates, and so they'll try to get people to have their own behind the meter natural gas fired electricity generators. They go to data centers. They've been lots of conversations from the providers saying, we really want to have clean, we want to be green. So we're going to be producing CO2 out of the stacks of gas-fired plants, but we want to find a place to put it. And so if you're going to build your own power plants, which are delayed because of turbine delays, and where you want to store, where you want to have the data centers that are relatively close by, then are there water floods in the area that could contain the CO2 instead of putting it down for CO2 injection for sequestration, which is a much more expensive proposition than trying to sequester it? Could you put it in the ground, for CO2 flooding. The permitting is less. It's only a Class 2 permit versus a Class 6. And because you do that as a way of getting the 45Q tax credit, it's a much more expedient pathway to getting all your permits to put the CO2 in the ground. It's a very common practice. They've been in Texas, they call them Class 2 injection permits. And if you've got a water flood that's not efficiently flooded, you can take and put the CO2 in the ground, and most of the CO2 doesn't come back up from experience. Most of it stays retained. If it comes back up, you strip it out and you put it back in again. I just haven't been able to identify people that would even care about that.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking to the right people. But
yeah, that is the tough part. Who's going to buy into it? And then, because it'd take a lot of work on the back end too, just to make sure that would even happen from like the tax credit level, for example, right? Let
no,
alone
you know what?
the science.
It does happen. I mean, for example, Oxy is one of the largest oil producers in Texas, and so much of the oil production they make is due to CO2 flooding.
I didn't know that about Oxy. That's
No, Oxy for over time it and they're yes, they're in the direct air capture business, but they're basically taking. The point is they're trying to do that right now, and they're in the new project they're getting the $85 tax credit, and that within the way the laws are now, that is and now that we know that there's all of this force to try to generate electricity for data centers, back to AI.
Yep.
The way you can handle that CO2 that's out of the stacks is to take it and put it somewhere safe.
What would you recommend that they be learning right now? Like, let's say they're senior in high school. Hopefully they've been studying or kind of have a direction, but maybe not. Like, what would you do today? What would you tell them to do?
So I would say that I'm speaking from the past area. If you want to really get exposed to people working in the oil and gas industry, and you want to have adventure, you want to travel and see the world. I've been really fortunate. I've seen lots of places and people and things. That's a great way to get experience that transfer to anywhere, but there's an accumulation of oil and gas around the world. If you're so physics and chemistry are key skills. And so I think that you can't take enough math, you can't take enough physics, and you can't take enough chemistry in school. And I think I think that's if you're drawn to that, and then if you're drawn to it depends. If you are a drilling engineer, then you're mechanically inclined, and you're wanting to try and make the hole and make it so that the hole can be useful. It's much more. It's the same sort of thing, but it's much more applied to the forces of drilling and completion the same way. If you're a completion oriented person and you're someone that operation oriented, where you want to work on the surface and trying to make sure the machinery all runs as safely, but it's still physics, chemistry. But if you're someone that's a reservoir engineer, then you're thinking about the integration of all these things subsurface, so you can use that to predict what will happen in the future. Because it's you can predict how much is there, and you can predict at the end of the day how much will be there. So it's a source of value. Reserves is a term that's used. How likely is reserve to? Is it very highly likely? Is it it could be just as likely yes or no that number, or only a 10% chance. That's just kind of the different buckets we put things into. So I would say that. But what I love about the reservoir part is it's a revolving mystery, and I'm trying to take all of these inferential information and tell a story that I can take and put physics and pressure and then predict what will happen in the future. So it's a lot of mathematics and a lot of and the most important thing that you're probably going to have no matter what you do study in school is you got to be able to communicate with people that don't know anything about what you do.
Yep.
You've got to speak in a language that you can explain to them where they get it, they understand, and not just live in your silo. And that's like any profession. But
yeah, 100%.
your effectiveness as a communicator is worth as much as all of the math and science you study, and that's not intuitive. So
Totally. Well, Jim,
so that answers the question.
Yeah. Love it. I was just gonna say you have such an interesting career. Just the stuff that we've been able to talk about, the range that you have, and just in talking through some of these ideas. Jim, thank you. We'll catch up again soon.
Peter, thank you very much. Goodbye.